Today is Earth Day, and so I wanted to come to the floor and reflect on some of the changes that our Earth is experiencing, and to talk at some length about how those changes are affecting my home state of Delaware, and how the Delaware community is studying, planning, and preparing to deal with these important changes. The water is rising, Mr. President, and for those of us from coastal states, and in particular for those of us in Delaware, it's rising fast. At just 60 feet, Delaware actually has the lowest mean elevation of any state in the United States, already making it more susceptible to sea level rise. But here's the thing, we also have another challenge in that the land itself is also sinking. There's a documented vertical movement of the Earth's crust underneath the mid-Atlantic coast, referred to as subsidence. And it's been happening in Delaware since the last ice age at a pace of roughly 2 millimeters every year. I know 2 millimeters doesn't sound like much, but it adds up to another 4 inches per century. In total, Mr. President, that means you've got between the water rising and the land sinking, making climate change and sea level rise specifically a very real issue for my state and for many other coastal states. An array of scientists of many different disciplines and backgrounds have studied this in and outside of the United States government, and they've developed 3 models for future scenarios. In the most conservative model, by the year 2100, the sea level in Delaware will rise about 0.5 meters, or about 1.5 feet. In another middle range model, the water in Delaware will rise by 1 full meter. And in the most troubling model, it'll rise 1.5 meters, or about 5 feet, between now and the end of this century. And unfortunately, at present, the scientific consensus, their shared estimate, is that this is the most likely model. Well, let's try and make that real, as we have in Delaware through a whole series of planning exercises to engage our coastal communities. Here's what these different projections look like in Bowers Beach, Delaware. It only takes 0.5 meter of sea level rise, shown here, before much of this community close to Dover Air Force Base in Kent County, Delaware, is underwater. 0.5 meter, the most conservative scenario, and by the end of the century, the majority of this community is underwater. At 1.5 meters, the most likely scenario in current estimates, the town is virtually gone. Here's another chart which we've shared with our communities in Delaware of sea level rise. It's a look at South Wilmington. The city of Wilmington, where I live, is very close to the Delaware River and has a whole lot of low-lying areas. This is part of the largest city in our state. And as water rises in the Atlantic, it also rises up the Delaware Bay and the Delaware River and the Christina River, which runs through most of Newcastle County and through this part of Wilmington. The water rises through the Peterson Wildlife Refuge as well. The calculation of whether we're going to be hit with 0.5 meter, 1 full meter, or 1.5 meters of sea level rise comes down to a question of the rate of acceleration of climate change globally. And it's also implicated in the question of whether we should be trying to slow the rate at which climate change is affecting our planet, and maybe even have some hope of turning the tide. This is the part of climate change policy known as mitigation. Priority 1 in this strategy is cutting the emissions we're pumping into our atmosphere that are driving this change. To do it, we need to diversify our energy sources and reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. Clean energy technology, energy efficiency programs, public transportation, recycling, and many other things could help cut down on these emissions. But it will require a global and coordinated effort to avoid or minimize these projected devastating local impacts. The second part of climate change policy is adaptation. It's based on accepting the reality our climate is changing and that it will have real effects on our planet and our communities. The truth is that even if we stopped all greenhouse gas emissions today, if we shut down our current power plants, stopped driving our current automobiles, stopped drilling and using gas-powered equipment on our farms, for trains, for ships, the amount of greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere would still take decades to dissipate. Changes in the world's climate are at this point inevitable. It's already happening and affecting our communities, and we can expect these impacts to intensify and accelerate as climate continues to change. In my view, we need to accept these facts and modify our behavior to prevent these effects from becoming cumulatively catastrophic. We can make better choices now to prevent a disaster later. Instead of running away from the science, Delaware's leaders have embraced it. The state agency that manages environmental issues for Delaware is known as DENREC. And under Secretary Colin O'Mara's able leadership, it's taken the lead on a government-wide project to assess our state's vulnerability to sea level rise and to recommend actions for adaptation. In fact, Delaware's Sea Level Rise Advisory Committee, whose report I have here, spent 18 months looking at 79 different statewide resources, vital things, roads and bridges, fire stations, schools, tourist hotspots, wetlands, and of course, our people, their homes, their businesses, and layered them on various maps, as I've shown, that demonstrated how far the water would reach at different projected sea levels. If sea level gets to 1.5 meters, we lose more than 10% of our state. The water claims 20,000 residential properties and significant percentages of the state's parks and wetlands, farms, highways, industrial sites, rail lines. In Delaware, we could lose 21 miles of rail lines to flooding, effectively shutting down Amtrak's Northeast Corridor. The vital port of Wilmington would be rendered useless on its current footprint. Nearly all the state's acreage of protected wetlands would be inundated and destroyed. Nearly 3/4 of the state's dams, dikes, and levees that we use to hold back the bay would be flooded. It would be simply devastating to our state. So to those who say, oh, a few feet of water rising over a century is a modest amount, something that we can plan for, something that we don't need to be alarmed about, I think this detailed and thorough study demonstrates the devastating consequences to my home state, a state that would lose 11% of its territory in the worst-case scenario. Mr. President, I'm proud of my state. I'm proud that Delaware was the first state to assess its vulnerability and the vulnerability of specific resources in as comprehensive a way as it has. We're determined to confront these changes to our planet head-on and to protect our own communities, to protect the way of life we've built. It's an approach that many other states, I hope, will replicate. Climate change is happening, Mr. President. It's happening right now. And while it may have local impacts, it has global causes, and we ignore these at our peril. I believe we have a responsibility to God's creation, a responsibility to each other, a responsibility to our home states and to future generations, to do our very best to slow this process, to help this planet, our only home, to survive.